13th, 2020 from King County Permitting Division, Department of Local Services.
Thank you. And then jumping down to page 143, who signed this letter?
It looks like Jim Chan, the division director, signed it.
Thank you. And I don't need to ask you to read every word, but what is stated in item number 6, transportation?
Yeah, essentially what is, I know I don't need to read the whole thing, but the most important part is it says, through the Snoqualmie Mill phase proposal, let me start over. Though the Snoqualmie Mill phase proposal will likely have negligible traffic impacts overall to unincorporated King County roads located in the vicinity of the proposed development, King County requests enhanced traffic management coordination with the city. So this is, to me, and it's an acknowledgement that from the county that the project would have the term negligible traffic impacts is what I would pull from this letter.
Thank you. And just the few words that followed where you stopped reading, when does King County request enhanced traffic management coordination?
Yes. So King County specifically requested enhanced traffic management coordination with the city in advance of and during special events, so that may take place on the site to lessen the likelihood. Yeah,
and I'm sorry, I wasn't trying to cut you off. I was just trying to clarify that was a reference to special events. Is that correct?
Yes,
thank you.
Correct.
And so there's no request in here for additional LOS analysis. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to go to exhibit S19, I believe, which is the comment letter from King County on the FEIS. Are you seeing that?
I am. Yes.
And is this from the same agency, signed by the same person?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And then just going to PDF page 8, the
Madam Examiner, before we do,
item.
I'd like to object to this use of the exhibit on hearsay grounds. I realize that hearsay is a frowned upon objection in hearing examiner proceedings. I thought the first letter was okay because it could reasonably have formed part of Mr. Schramm's analysis, but this letter came out after Mr. Schramm's analysis was already done. It can't have played any role in what he did.
And I would say just the question of whether the responsible agency weighed in on a need for additional traffic impacts, or their belief about the sufficiency of the FEIS to speak to issues that they were concerned about is relevant to the question of whether the FEIS is adequate in this manner.
My objection is not based on relevance. Call Jim Chan if you want him to testify about his own letter.
Ms. Examiner, may I be heard
Yes,
briefly?
you may be heard, Mr. Scribner.
Thank you. This exhibit was offered by the appellants. Mr. Seidels is objecting on hearsay grounds to his own exhibit.
I recognize that. We have the letter in the record at the behest of appellants, and I have a witness here who is being asked to speak to King County comments in total. And again, hearsay is frowned upon objection, as you put it, Mr. Seidels. I'm going to let him speak to the letter.
Thank you. I guess my only question is, does this letter indicate any concern regarding the issue of intersections on Route 202 and 203, a need for LOS analysis, as Mr. Norris was suggesting?
No, it does not.
Thank you. Mr. Norris also stated that there should have been analysis of potential traffic diversion to other routes in the Snoqualmie Valley because of delays at the I-90 SR18 interchange. Do you recall that?
I do.
And could you respond to that, please?
Yes. Again, this is a comment that is identified as a should be, but I'm still happy to respond to because we responded in the FEIS as well. Essentially, what I believe Mr. Norris is saying is that because the I-90 SR18 interchange is congested, that there may be traffic that is diverting or using other routes. And as a result, more analysis is needed as a result of that. And I would disagree. And the reason that we didn't consider that is because even at the time that we did the draft EIS in 2018, 2019, we knew and we understood that the interchange was funded and would be completed within a few year time frame. And although that time frame has slid a little bit, it is still anticipated to be constructed here in a few years. And so I believe any diversions or anticipated diversions as a result of that will be quickly alleviated when the interchange opens.
Thank you. There was another comment about Mr. Norris testified that it was likely that trucks would park along the I-90 interchange, or that there would not be adequate truck parking on site to serve the project, and that impacts would result from that. Could you respond to that comment, please?
Yes, I will. I believe what Mr. Norris was indicating is that currently and historically, trucks have been parking on or near the interchange. And my understanding, as I did a little bit of research into that, is that those trucks that are parking there are considered long haul trucks. And predominantly what that means is that trucks that are traveling from one destination, from an origin to a destination, have a requirement to stop, or they just desire to stop in order to rest. And they use this interchange or some of the interchange areas as a convenient location for that. These types of trucks, these existing trips and historic, trucks that are there are not related to the project. And nor do I anticipate that the trucks that would be generated by this project would do the same thing. Because these are long haul trucks, that's what it's an existing condition that happens. I can't say whether or not those areas will be removed or modified with a new interchange project, but what I can say as it relates to the project is there is truck parking that has been identified and allocated on the site plan, or at least a preliminary site plan. And because the site is located, several miles north of here, there wouldn't, in my opinion, be any reason for a truck that is generated by the site to go park on the interchange when they can easily just park on the site.
Thank you. Mr. Norris also commented about road conditions, essentially that traffic from the project could damage conditions or exacerbate damaged conditions on nearby roadways. Do you recall those comments?
I do.
And could you respond to those, please?
Yes, I'd say a couple things to those comments. The project improvements are going to focus on the roadways that are primarily affected, which is a common practice. In some cases, those are things like frontage improvements. In this particular case, what the project is going to do is modify and upgrade Mill Pond Road, not only with a realignment, but it'll bring Mill Pond Road and its current configuration or location. It will modify it and upgrade it to a standard city road section. And I'm not going to cite the specifics because those are already in the city road standards in the code. But what the project will do to address its impact onto the roadways is to upgrade Mill Pond Road, upgrade the Hall Road for truck use. And the other thing that I would say in response to his comment is the city's 6-year transportation plan, as well as our comprehensive plan, identifies roadways and roadway needs to be upgraded as needed to accommodate growth, to accommodate modified pavement and things like that. So those are certainly planned and anticipated that the city are going to upkeep and take care of the roadways within their jurisdiction. And then the last thing I'd say as it relates to this comment is related to trucks. I think
I'm sorry, before you move off the last comment, could you just clarify why city's plans that you just referred to, how that plays in here? Why does that why is that a response to what Mr. Norris was saying about this project should identify where, you know, its own traffic will go? Or, sorry, that was not a well-worded question.
Yeah.
What is the relevance of the city's existing plans to the assertion that this project could create further impacts on sections of the roadway?
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring it up is because my interpretation of some of Mr. Norris's testimony is that these roadways, many of these roadways, and he provided pictures and testimony about they're damaged and not designed well. What I'm responding to is the fact that the city in their both their comprehensive plan as well as their transportation plan do have identified funding for upgrade of roads and maintenance of roads. And so to suggest that nothing is going to happen to these roads is not accurate. The city is a responsibility to make sure they upkeep these roads. That was the purpose of that comment.
Thank you. And I'm sorry I cut you off before you were about to make your third point, if you recall what that was.
Yeah, let me see if I can remember. Oh yeah, it was about the trucks. Mr. Norris, had indicated, this project is going to generate trucks. It absolutely will. And particularly for the industrial park uses, there'll be some heavy trucks and they'll need to get in and out of the site. As I mentioned, not only will Mill Pond Road be upgraded to accommodate trucks and the increase of trucks, so will the Hall Road. And my expectation is that trucks would comply with the weight limits posted. I think he had several photos and pictures that indicated where weight limits would be restricted. I don't see any reason to think that trucks would not, obey those, and abide by those signs and laws. This is not only what's the relevance
of weight limits?
Yeah.
What it is ensure?
Well, weight limits could be a number of things. And I think in Mr. Norris's testimony, he suggested one of the reasons could be is because of the current degradation of those roads. Yeah, that's entirely possible. Other reasons for weight limits are because a roadway where the sign is located of weight limit may be because somewhere further down the line or down the road, there may be a bridge or another structure that can't accommodate that load and a truck has no ability to turn around. There may be a number of reasons for weight limit signs, but what I'm suggesting is that I would expect the trucks to abide by those signs. And the other thing I would mention is that, and as part of our response in the EIS, we had identified the need for a construction management plan. Again, it's a standard practice and it's something that we would recommend and anticipate would be required for this project as it develops, that it provide a construction management plan. One of the common elements of a construction management plan is a haul route agreement. And what that does is it requires or it identifies the specific routes that trucks are allowed to travel. And so any assertion or suggestion that trucks are just going to go wherever they want, and impact all these roads is just not true. The haul agreement would be a good example of something that will ensure that the trucks are remaining on the roads that they should be using.
Thank you. And so that gets into the next issue I was going to ask about, which is the discussion of construction impacts. And we're almost done here. There's just a couple more points to hit. Do you recall the discussion of a construction management plan?
Yes.
And very briefly, can you summarize what that would involve? Or could involve?
Yeah, a construction management plan I understand is a kind of a general term and it's a plan, but construction management plan is very common for developments. And especially, projects that have multiple phases and are built up over a time period. Construction management plans have things like schedules and estimates of truck generation, when are those trucks going to occur, what hours they can occur, and I mentioned a haul route agreement, things like that control where construction traffic can go and what it would be generated. And it also can provide or put limits on hours of the day that trucks can or can't be operated.
Thank you. And is a construction management plan for this project included in the EIS?
Yes, the construction management plan is an element that we propose should be required for this project.
Thank you. And I will, I guess what I was asking is an actual document that represents the construction management plan that will be used for planning area 1, is such a document included in the EIS?
No, a specific detailed construction management plan has not been identified. The
Thank you.
idea that one should be is what's referred to.
And why is such a document not included in the EIS?
Well, because it's not this typical or standard sequence of when it should occur. Construction management plan is developed and adopted and ultimately approved once more is known about the project, more detailed, how many trucks, what routes. It's just at a later stage. And it's just not, this isn't the time to have it developed. There's not enough details about the project that would make sense to implement it at this point.
Can a construction management plan successfully be implemented at a later stage, given what the information that's been identified thus far?
Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. And was there, I think that was everything. Was there anything else in Mr. Norris's testimony about construction impacts that you would like to address, or that would not be addressed by the construction management plan practice that you've just described?
Yeah, I had a couple notes that I took from when he was testifying. I think one of the things, whether in his testimony or his prior comments, there may have been some confusion about the time period of construction activity.
Yes, thank you.
I think one of the things that was described in the EIS is that construction activity is expected to occur within the first 2 years of each planning area. And I think there was some confusion about, does that mean construction activity will take place over 2 years? Because I think somewhere else in the report we talked about the construction activity will take place for about a year. And I understand the confusion, but the clarification is that we don't know when that 1 year period will occur. We're expecting it to occur within the first 2 years of the planning area, but it's only expected to occur for about a year in duration.
Thank you. Was that the only issue?
I believe so. I can't remember anything else about that.
Thank you. Just 2 more points I want to hit. Number 1, there was discussion of transit impacts, and you described the initial transportation analysis that you conducted earlier. And could you please summarize what you understood Mr. Norris's criticism of the transit analysis to be?
Yeah, I believe Mr. Norris was suggesting that there was insufficient or not enough analysis of transit issues in the EIS.
Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say a couple things. Part of this is a repeat of what I said before, but the EIS and the draft EIS did, in fact, describe existing transit use as an existing condition, and I testified to it earlier today about existing transit service. Because of the location in a suburban area, I also described the fact that this area is generally not served well by transit, and that is controlled by King County. And reviewing King County documents and plans, we were not able to find any identifiable or modifications or improvements or enhancements, at least currently identified, to the transportation system in this area. So it wasn't that transit issues were insufficient, in my opinion. It's just that they weren't emphasized because the amount of transit activity is expected to be minimal or minor, at least initially, because the existence of transit service is just not significant. So again, this was done intentionally because our focus was ensuring that the impact of vehicular traffic was emphasized to ensure that there was adequate mitigations for transportation impacts from vehicles and trucks.
Thank you. And the last issue I believe that I want to ask you about is that there has been some discussion of, you've been talking about with regard to several of these issues, improvements to the city's roadway network that could occur in the future or that are planned for the future. And you talked about the city's TIP. There's also some discussion in the EIS of the possibility of a pro rata share from the applicant for funding of those transportation improvements. What does that mean? What does that involve?
Yes, I'd be happy to explain. So probably the easiest way to explain it was to take one step back again, and that is the purpose of the traffic analysis is to identify, when we compare the action to the no action, what improvements are needed to ensure that the study intersections operate at an acceptable level. Okay, so that's our first, and that's our primary consideration in the traffic analysis. As part of that analysis, we consider what projects are identified, approved, adopted, planned by the agency. And the city does have a 6-year plan. And in the case of the 2023 analysis with Planning Area 1, none of the roadways that were identified in the plan were expected to be completed at that time. So that was not included in our analysis as a possible funding source. Regardless, it wasn't necessary because the only location that was needed for mitigation was the Fisher Avenue location. Where the timing and funding question becomes most important, or more relevant, I should say, is when we look at the full build out condition. So at some point in the future, again, we projected 2032, at some point when the project is fully built, we want to make sure we understand what improvements are needed to the study area intersections. We did that. We identified several intersections, several locations that are projected to operate at unacceptable levels of service. And so then we go to the effort of determining what specific improvements are needed. In this case, some of the improvements that are required are already identified in the city's 6-year TIP. So we make reference to the fact that the how and when those improvements get implemented may have the ability to have some city funding help or assistance, and in which case the project could pay a proportionate share or pro rata share. That's what you asked me, what is pro rata share? So in those cases where the city has an adopted plan and the project has an impact, they can pay a proportionate share toward the city's project, should the city get enough funding to build that project. There's other locations that are identified for improvements that are needed that are not on the city's plan. So where the understanding of timing and funding of the city's plan is the purpose of it is to help identify which of the improvements have the potential to be funded with and work with the city to fund and complete. And then there's a separate list or a pot that says these are improvements that would need to be required by the development because there's no identified city plan for those.
Thank you. That was slightly broader than my question, but I think
okay.
you summarized the issue. Is there anything else that you would want to say on that point before I move off of it?
I don't think so, especially given that I expanded already on your question.
No, that was not a criticism. Thank you. Mr. Schramm, I would just then ask you, is there anything else that Mr. Norris said that you would like to respond to that I have not asked you about?
Is there anything technically on his 8 items that he addressed? No, I think we've addressed each one of those sufficiently.
Thank you. And is there anything else that I haven't asked you about in general that you'd like the hearing examiner to know before your direct exam concludes?
Well, I sort of do. I know I've been talking for quite a while, but I feel this need, this examiner, to address the issue of painting a rosier picture. I know I've been in front of you on many different hearings, but in this particular case, I think it's important because statements like that sort of go to the credibility, in my opinion, of the analysis that was conducted. And while I'll be careful not to take too much exception to the comment, I understand, why it was made. I would just like to say that, the analysis that we did for the CIS is it's sufficient, it's thorough. It evaluates the impact of not only the action and no action for Planning Area 1, but also build out. We carefully considered, comments from local agencies to make sure that our study was comprehensive and it evaluated what it needed to evaluate. And we looked at the level service standards and how the city evaluates level service to make sure that there are adequate mitigations identified to make sure that the impact of this project is sufficiently mitigated. And while that mitigation plan will ultimately be adopted, at some point in the future, the framework of it, the list of improvements that are needed is there. And those improvements, we believe, are adequate to mitigate the impacts of what is proposed for both the planning area 1 and planning area 2-3 build out. So we stand behind the analysis. I appreciate the opportunity to respond, to some of the maybe criticisms or comments, and I believe we've done that. And I also understand that the next step is for me to answer other questions that are ready, and I'm ready for them. But I would ask for a break so I can use the bathroom and get some water.
Oh my gosh, you're not the only one.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for sitting through that. That concludes the direct exam.
Now, clearly, this was a significant percentage of the issues that were going to be discussed, and I felt like nothing was belabored. Let's take a break though, and I'm going to ask for a generous break for the purposes of my spine health. So I don't know if the parties would object to 15 minutes. I could also do with 10. 15 is good. Okay, great. It's 3:15. We'll come back at 3:30 and begin with cross exam.
Thank you.
Sorry. Forgot I was muted. We'll start with the city, I believe, in response.
Yes.
Cross-examination.
Thank you, Ms. Examiner, and I'll be brief. Good afternoon, Mr. Schramm, and thank you for taking all the time you did this afternoon to go through these complicated issues. You talked a little bit about the level of service analysis at the I-90 Snoqualmie Parkway interchange. And I think you said that the LOS analysis was based on the 2018 traffic counts. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes, the initial analysis we did in the draft EIS was based on those counts. Yes.
Okay. And and then you talked also about the future proposed improvement and the timeline for that and WashDOT funding. If there were other improvements to that intersection subsequent to the 2018 counts and analysis, is it possible that the level of service there that exists today as we sit here today is different than was described in the DEIS analysis?
Yes, if there were subsequent improvements since that time and before the full interchange, that the level of service could have changed. Yes.
Okay. Are you aware of any temporary improvements to that interchange since 2018?
Yes, I am. I know and understand that there was a southbound or a modification, or I guess we'd call an upgrade to the southbound right turn lane from off Snoqualmie Parkway directly onto the I-90 westbound ramp.
All right. And in your opinion, as a traffic engineer, is it reasonable to expect that improvement, or perhaps do you know, did it improve the level of service at that interchange?
Yeah. I can't say definitively because I didn't study it, but with 27 years of experience and having driven that many times, I know that improvement has helped.
All right. And does that reinforce your conclusion about the significance of an impact, if any, between project opening and completion of the full interchange improvements?
It doesn't change my opinion significantly. It just informs my opinion that improvement was helpful, and the traffic off of the parkway is operating better than it was before that modification.
All right, I guess maybe I didn't phrase the question very clearly. I think you stated a conclusion about that if there's a time gap between completion of the full interchange improvement and project opening, I thought you said you didn't view that impact to be significant. Am I understanding that part right?
Can you rephrase? I just want to make sure I'm carefully answering this. Let's try a third time. Third time's a charm.
All right, my apologies then for not being clear. So I'm thinking about if there's a time difference between when planning area 1 of the mill site is completed and full improvements to the I-90 Parkway interchange are completed. Mr. Cartman asked you a little bit about that, correct?
Yes.
And what's your opinion about whether there's an impact from a time gap between completion of planning area 1 and completion of the interchange improvements?
Yeah. I would say that there still will be an impact, because if traffic is generated from planning area 1 to the interchange before it's built, there will be an impact. I think the impact will be less now that the additional southbound lane from Snoqualmie Parkway has been implemented.
Okay, and is that because, well, in the prior, your level of service analysis was delay from the southbound Parkway leg onto westbound I-90? Was that a significant factor in the LOSF rating?
It is a significant factor. It's particularly a significant factor in the morning peak hour when the highest volume is coming off of the Parkway onto I-90.
All right, and has that delay of southbound Parkway to westbound I-90 been essentially eliminated by the temporary project that was completed?
The delay is essentially eliminated because it's a free flow lane onto I-90. Correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and screen share to something that I think that you showed previously.
Okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. All right. Can you see the exhibit on the screen?
Yes, I can.
All right. And this is from the draft environmental impact statement. And I think that you spoke to this a little bit. It's exhibit 2.3.5. And I think you said this is a conceptual layout of the traffic improvements anticipated to Mill Pond Road.
Yes, I believe that's what I said.
Okay. And so given that conceptual level, certain details, for example, you pointed to these pedestrian crossings. If there were to be, say, traffic control devices included as part of that, that would not be shown on this design, but could be added later as design and construction of those improvements is completed.
Yes, in fact, as a traffic engineer, this is conceptual because there are some basic elements of roundabout design that I do not see here. So I would expect that there would be additional enhanced design elements to ensure that it's designed properly.
Okay. And so if, for example, the city were, well, sorry, let me back up. Are you familiar with rectangular rapid flashing beacons?
Yes, I am.
Or RRFBs. So if the city wanted to include RRFBs for pedestrian crossings in this vicinity, the time to do that would be later when more specific engineering and construction plans are prepared.
That's correct. The time to design those would be when the overall intersection is being designed.
Okay, so there's future opportunities to look at that.
Yes.
All right, thanks. I don't have any further questions, and thank you again, Mr. Schramm, for your detailed testimony.
Yes, thank you.
All right, great. Thank you. We'll move on to cross-examination by Mr. Seidels.
Thank you, Madam Examiner.
And I'm sorry, Madam Examiner, may I just inquire, since the city has another witness on this topic waiting, does Mr. Seidels, I know it's been a long afternoon, have a sense of how long cross-examination might go?
Not long. I've only got about, I don't know, 20 or 25 questions. The bulk of where I want to go next on traffic will be rebuttal testimony by Mr. Norris, which I think we'll probably do tomorrow. Yes?
If we do, yeah, I expect rebuttal testimony to be tomorrow.
Okay.
I don't think we're going to get there tonight. I think we were being ambitious.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's kind of what I'm thinking too. Okay, well, that's fine. Let me just do my cross then and we can move on to the next witness.
All right. Thank you for that, Mr. Seidels.
Mr. Schramm, are most of your clients government agencies or developers?
We have We have both, but I would say it's majority of them are private development.
Can you give me a sense of the percentage?
It's probably 80-20 toward private development.
Okay. Has a local jurisdiction in the course of permitting and environmental review ever required you to go back and redo a traffic count because your first traffic count was too old?
I would say it's probably happened a couple times, yes.
How many times is a couple times
Maybe 3 or 4 times
in the course of your whole career?
in the course of my whole career, yes.
And how old were the traffic counts in those instances?
Boy, it's been a while. It's probably been at least 5 years since I've had to do since that specific situation happened to me.
Do you recall how old the traffic count was in any of these instances?
Not specifically, but probably in the range of 2 to 3 years.
Okay, thank you. Do you remember when you were testifying about differences between traffic in January, February versus traffic during the summer? Do you recall that?
Yes.
And do you recall Mr. Norris's testimony that at least on SR 18, the summer rates are 26% higher than the January, February rates?
I recall that he mentioned that there was a 26% difference. I don't remember if he was comparing the January counts or the summer counts.
Do you believe Mr. Norris was factually incorrect to say that the summer counts are 26% higher on SR 18?
Yes, because I'm now looking at Mr. Norris's July 3rd, 2020 memo on page 3 at the top. Under the topic of traffic counts, he says, a review of the traffic count data on SR 18 at I-90 indicates the January volume is 26% lower than average daily volume. So he was referring to 26% to the January volume.
Do you agree that Mr. Norris was saying the January volume is lower than the average volume?
Yes.
26% lower?
Yes, that's what he said.
Do you think he is factually correct in that statement?
Yes, when I reviewed what I believe is the same traffic count data that he referenced, I believe that percentage is correct.
When you were doing your traffic analysis for this project, why didn't you account for the fact that at least on SR 18, the January, February traffic is 26% lower?
We didn't review the traffic count data on State Route 18 because that segment of State Route 18 wasn't identified in our study area.
Did you review traffic counts on any other routes outside your study area, such as SR 202, for example?
Yeah, as part of our work, we reviewed traffic counts on 202 and I-90.
So you are capable then of reviewing traffic counts outside your study area, are you not?
Yes.
Why didn't you review the traffic count for SR 18?
Because we didn't review the traffic count for SAR 18 because it was outside of our immediate study area. It wasn't an area that was identified for evaluation.
Yeah, but that's true of SR 202 and I-90, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So why did you analyze those areas but not SR 18?
We analyzed, I reviewed in particular the counts on State Route 202 in more detail, predominantly as a response to the comments in the draft EIS to confirm that the analysis that we did was appropriate. And so our more detailed review of the counts on 202 was in response to the comments from the draft EIS.
Well, didn't the comments from the draft EIS also raise traffic on SR 18?
Yes.
Well, so why didn't you take that opportunity to go back and review traffic on SR 18 like you did for SR 202?
Well, I did take that opportunity to review, and as I indicated, I concur and agree with the 26% reduction. I did look at it after I received the comment, and as a responsible part of our analysis to respond to the comments in the final EIS.
And knowing then that the traffic on SR 18 is substantially lower in January than it is on average throughout the year, did you then go back and revise any of your analysis to take account of that information?
No, we did not.
I understood your testimony to be that at least on roads other than SR 18, the seasonal difference is only about 10%, not 26%. Did I understand you correctly?
Yes.
Did you conduct any 24-hour counts? Well, let me think. Did you conduct any traffic counts outside of January, February to confirm or deny your feeling that there's only 10% variance in January, February?
We did not conduct additional traffic counts. We reviewed the permanent traffic count data that WashDOT has at the 3 permanent count locations.
Okay. In the FEIS, in your response to comments on the draft, this is PDF 201, 202 of the final EIS, you said that traffic within the city of Snoqualmie does not vary very much by season. What was your basis for that statement?
Can you refer me to the specific
Yeah,
location?
I'll have to do a screen share.
Okay.
So what did I say? 201 and 202. Let's see. Okay, I am calling up a screen share now. All righty. Oh, I just hate when it does this. It just drives me nuts. All right. I've highlighted some text on PDF page 202. On your screen, do you see the highlighted text?
I do.
It says, it should also be noted that the monthly volume on, well, no.
I can still see it.
You can see it? Well, I can't. All right, now I can. It should also be noted that the monthly volume on local Snoqualmie streets does not fluctuate as much as traffic on state highways and is typically within 10%, which is also generally within the range of daily traffic fluctuations. Did you write that sentence?
Yes.
What is your basis for this claim that volume on local streets does not fluctuate as much as traffic on state highways? Is that based on data?
Yeah, I understand your question now. Yes. So we, when we received the comment in the draft EIS, not only did we review the permanent traffic count locations that WashDOT had at the locations I mentioned, we also requested historic traffic count information from the city. And based on our review of some of those historic counts and recent counts, that's where we drew the conclusion in that statement that the monthly fluctuation is within about 10%.
Is that data available for anyone's review?
It was not provided as part of this record. It was just based on our preparation and response to that comment.
So you have nothing to show us to back up that statement other than your testimony right now. Is that correct?
Well, I have it. It's just not been presented in the record.
Okay. Did you conduct any LOS analysis for Saturday volumes?
We did not evaluate level service on Saturday.
Why not?
Well, the focus of our analysis as established in the scoping was during the weekday AM and PM peak hours.
I understand that you chose that as your focus. I'm asking why not think about other things as well, such as Saturday volumes?
Well, again, part of my answer is still the same. When we scoped this analysis with the city, the focus that was identified was during the weekday AM and PM peak hours. I would say that majority of the traffic studies that we do and that I've seen other traffic engineers do focus on weekday peak hours, and only under special circumstances or other time periods like Saturdays or Sundays evaluated.
But why was that the scope? You keep saying that was the scope, or the scope was chosen. I noticed your use of the passive voice when you said that, but why was that the decision?
Well, for one, the city's comprehensive plan and their adopted level service standards are based on the weekday peak hour, for one. And number two, again, we rely heavily on the scoping process. The local agency, in this case, the city of Snoqualmie, indicated the time period and as well as the study intersections and other scope elements that were important to understand to evaluate impacts of the environment. Without sharing detailed data, which I don't have available, in my 27 years of experience, when on other projects where we have either evaluated or reviewed or compared weekday peak hours with weekend peak hours, typically, not always, but typically weekday peak hours have a higher volume of traffic than on Saturdays.
Doesn't that vary based on whether the uses are, say, residential versus recreational?
It varies based on a number of factors, those including some of them.
And did you evaluate any of those factors here?
Which particular factors?
Well, did you think about any factors that might be present at this project site that would potentially lead to higher weekend traffic?
Not to the extent that it would influence our decision to evaluate the Saturday peak hour.
And that decision, again, was based on guidance you received from the city?
Yes.
Would you say the city was not interested in knowing the weekend LOS?
I can't say that.
Well, if they were interested, wouldn't they have asked you?
Objection. It's calling for speculation about the motives of the city.
Okay, so we'll handle this like we do other speculation objections. We'll note it and allow you to address it on redirect.
So then the question stands, Mr. Schramm, did the city simply not express any interest in knowing about weekend LOS?
What I recall in our discussions with the city was that they required and requested us to estimate trip generation for the project during the Saturday time period, but did not require specific intersection level service during the Saturday time period.
Why not?
I can't answer why the city didn't request that or require that information.
But isn't traffic an impact to the environment, whether it's Monday through Friday or the weekend?
Yeah, this project will generate traffic on every day of the week.
Did I understand your testimony correctly that the ITE model is a standard model to use in your field?
Yes, my testimony was that the ITE trip generation manual is a standard manual used in our profession.
And does the ITE trip generation manual say that local studies should be done when possible?
I believe it does, yes.
Did you do any local trip generation studies?
We did not.
Why not?
Well, primarily because they're the specifics of this project, the mix of uses, the industrial park, the retail, and the residential. I'm not aware of a comparable or a series of comparable sites that would be representative of what's being proposed. Also, because there's nothing that we could think of that had kind of the regional characteristics that Snoqualmie does for this project. I don't believe there is a comparable project where data could be collected that would be representative of what's being proposed.
Is there some other more localized trip generation method that you could have used besides the ITE method?
There are some other methods. There are some other data that can be pulled from the PSRC model as well.
Did you pull that data from the PSRC model?
We did not.
Why not?
Primarily because we believe that in our profession that the data set that comes from the IT trip generation manual is made up of hundreds and in some cases thousands of studies of similar uses, and it's a reliable source for estimating traffic generation. And frankly, it's easier to use because their data is readily available for this purpose. Pulling data out of the PSRC model is a very complex process, and there's no guarantee that it can provide as accurate of information, and nor has it been proven, from what I can tell, to be a better source of data than the IT trip generation manual.
But isn't the PSRC model based on the local geography of the Puget Sound region?
Yeah, the PSRC model is, as it's titled, Puget Sound region. It represents the region of the Puget Sound area.
Whereas the ITE model is drawn from geography nationwide, correct?
Correct.
Doesn't that make the PSRC model more precise for projects that are occurring within the Puget Sound area, such as this one?
Can you re-ask that?
Yes. Wouldn't you get a more precise and accurate understanding of traffic using a model that had been developed for Puget Sound than you would using a model that drew from nationwide data?
It's possible.
Didn't that provide you some motivation to try out the PSRC model?
No, not in this case. As I testified before, the predominance of traffic studies utilize the IT manual as sort of the guidebook, if I could use that term, of traffic generation estimates for a variety of different developments.
Okay. And when you say the ITE model is based on hundreds, if not thousands of case studies, does that mean that there are hundreds, if not thousands of case studies of projects similar to this one?
It's hard to say whether there are any, if hundreds or thousands. It's hard to say whether what percent or how many of those studies are similar to this one that's being proposed.
Ms. Examiner, may I interpose a clarification objection? There's been reference to the ITE trip generation manual and a PSRC model, and then sometimes ITE model versus the manual. And just so that the record's clear, and I don't want to get in the way of individual questions, maybe Mr. Seidels could make clear which one he's referring to specifically.
I was also wondering if the ITE model is a different document than the ITE manual, Mr. Seidels.
No, they are the same document, Madam Examiner. I
Okay,
apologize.
so just using that phrase interchangeably.
You got it.
Okay, so ITE manual is the only one. Okay.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yep. In the ITE model, Mr. Schramm, what percentage of trips are transit trips like buses?
Well, let me clarify first. I think you mean the IT manual. Is that, I just want to make sure you're
I
clear.
do.
Yes, okay. I think you said model, if I misunderstood you. The um, the percentage of transit trips that is provided in the IT manual vary. There is not a precise or a specific amount. It varies based on the land use type and the location of that land use, whether it's in a suburban area or an urban area.
But there certainly are some transit trips baked into the ITE manual, right?
I wouldn't say that they're baked in. The IT manual can provide information about non-vehicle use such as transit, pedestrian, and bikes. Yes.
And when you applied the ITE manual to do your analysis for this project, did the ITE manual include transit trips?
It does not, because the use categories that we use were for suburban areas, and there's no transit. There's no transit and non-vehicle specific estimates for suburban areas. Those are limited to more urban areas in that category.
So then did you do any modeling of transit trips related to this project?
No, we did not.
And why not?
Well, as I testified before, and I'll say again that there's limited presence of transit currently with no known plans for increased transit service. Given the location of the property is not immediately served by transit. There is transit on 202, but that's not immediate to the site. And the fact that the trip generation does not identify a noticeable or a quantifiable number of transit trips. In my professional opinion, I don't believe this project would generate a significant amount of transit trips.
But that's not based on any kind of data or modeling?
Well, it's based on the data that the IT trip generation manual would indicate that non-vehicle trips in suburban areas are minimal.
Is that true of all suburban areas according to the ITE manual?
It's generally referenced in that regard, yes.
What about PSRC? Does it allow for transit trips in suburbia?
I am not as familiar technically with the inner workings of the PSRC model, so I would not be able to tell you how or how much transit use is included in the PSRC model.
All right. Does the ITE manual instruct you to use 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. for the peak hour trips?
No, I believe it just identifies a term called the weekday PM peak hour. I don't believe it identifies a specific time period. I think the term is adjacent street peak hour.
Doesn't the ITE manual tell you to conduct local studies when possible to determine when the peak hour trips will occur in a particular area?
I'm not certain if the IT manual indicates that for the purpose of determining the peak hour to conduct counts, but I'm not certain on that.
And just to be clear, you did not conduct any counts to determine whether 7 to 9 and 4 to 6 were the correct peak hours?
We did not conduct the counts that were included in the level service analysis. We reviewed after the draft EIS in response to the comments in the draft EIS. We reviewed additional counts that the city of Snoqualmie provided to review the peak time periods to confirm whether the 7 to 9 and 4 to 6 period was accurate.
And when you did that, you used the, you had some term for it, which I forget, but it was the fixed location sites that have been in operation for a while, the ones with the cameras.
No, not precisely. The counts, the counts that we collected at the study intersections were, we used a third-party traffic counting company, and the way that they collect their counts is they install cameras at the location of each intersection that the video is used to collect the data. It's just it's a more efficient way than sending someone out there. 10, 15, 20 years ago, people would actually go out with a count board and click and count the cars that are going through. This is using cameras and a computer assistance. It's a more efficient and cost-effective way of collecting traffic count data.
All right. What is your understanding of the definition of a pass-by trip?
My understanding of the definition of a pass-by trip is a trip that is already existing on the adjacent roadway network that is passing by the site that will be generated into the site as a result of a new use, such as a retail.
Adjacent roadway network, you said, right?
Yes.
Do pass-by trips also include trips that are merely nearby, or does it have to be adjacent?
Well, what my testimony was earlier when we talked about this was the IT manual classifies trips as pass-by and non-pass-by. Trips that are not immediately adjacent, and I'm going to use an additional descriptor of adjacent. Immediately adjacent in this case would be Mill Pond Road. What we considered a type of pass-by trip is adjacent, or in this case nearby. State Route 202 carries a lot more traffic than Mill Pond Road does. And so a non-new trip or a pass-by type trip that we utilize in our analysis, which is specifically identified or described as a diverted trip, or more appropriately described as a diverted trip, is what we utilized as a pass-by element of this project.
So you were counting trips on SR 202 as pass-by trips, even though SR 202 is not adjacent to this site?
That's correct.
Call up a number that we've referenced. This is going to be Appendix F. It will be PDF page 815 of Appendix F.
FEIS or DEIS?
Sorry, it's DEIS Appendix F, PDF page 815. It will be familiar to us all. Let me just get it here. Yeah. Now I'm trying to zoom in. This is just so frustrating how it does this. There. All right. So, Mr. Schramm, do you recognize this page from your earlier testimony?
Yes, I do.
All right. This is showing the pass-by trips, is it not?
Pass-by trips are included in this
Right.
graphic.
Pass-by
Yes.
34%. You see where I've highlighted that?
Yes.
And then the total number of these pass-by trips is highlighted over here in the right column, 1,513. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Are those trips on SR 202, the 1,513?
Those 1,513 trips would be from SR 202. Yes.
Okay. You may have answered this already, but I think I'll give you one last chance to explain. Why didn't you model pedestrian, bicycle, and transit trips for this project?
You're correct. I did respond to this earlier, and I'd be happy to do that again. several reasons. One is that this location in a suburban area, we would anticipate that the generation of pedestrian and transit and bicycle trips would be minimal because of its general suburban location. Another reason is that in order to provide an appropriately conservative analysis, conservative meaning worst case, we estimated that all of the traffic generation would be vehicular driven in order to ensure that the roadway system and the study area intersections were adequately evaluated for level service impact.
Okay. Where in the FEIS do you, or anyone else for that matter, analyze strategies to encourage pedestrian, bicycle, and transit trips as opposed to vehicle trips?
I don't believe anywhere, to my knowledge, in the FEIS, we evaluated strategies.
When the state installed the roundabout on Tokel Road near the railroad bridge, did the installation of that roundabout prevent queuing onto the railroad bridge?
I would say that I would say that the installation of the roundabout wouldn't and doesn't prevent queuing. I would say that the roundabout helps minimize queuing, especially when compared to if that intersection were signalized.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to expand on that more, but that's a more precise answer.
No, it's an excellent answer. Thank you. Where, if anywhere, in the EIS do you measure the increased traffic in the roundabout itself that will occur as a result of this project?
Yeah, so I'll speak generally, and it would take me quite a while to determine the exact page. But there are several locations within the EIS, and predominantly in the exhibits and that provide figures or boxes of future traffic volumes at each of the intersections, all 23 of them. So we illustrated future traffic volumes in, like, for example, at the Tokel roundabout for 2023 no action, 2023 with planning area 1, 2032 no action, and 2032 with full build out for both the AM and PM peak hours. So future traffic volumes are illustrated in a number of different graphics.
And having done that analysis, did you conclude that the Tokel Road roundabout has sufficient capacity to accommodate all the new traffic that will be generated by this project?
No, it will not. The Tokel roundabout in its existing configuration is adequate, according to our analysis, to accommodate some background growth at the time with planning area 1. Our analysis concluded that with full build out in 2032 plus background growth, the existing configuration of the roundabout is not sufficient to result in an acceptable level service.
But luckily, there's a plan afoot to widen the roundabout, right?
There is not currently a plan to widen the roundabout.
Oh dear. Does that mean then, Mr. Schramm, that the full build out of this project will result in an unacceptable level of service to the Tokel Road roundabout?
If it remains in its existing configuration, yes.
Do you have any reason to believe that it will not remain in its existing configuration?
Absolutely. One of the elements of our analysis was, as I testified to earlier, was to identify improvements that would improve the overall intersection of the overall operation of the intersection to an acceptable level with considering the full build out of the project. So in fact, our analysis and findings indicate that the roundabout would need to be widened. It would need to be widened in order to accommodate what we call a multi-lane, or in this case, a 2-lane roundabout, in order to accommodate the future traffic growth.
And when will the Tokel roundabout be widened to a multi-lane roundabout?
We did not specifically identify a year or a phase, but what we did confirm is that the Tokel roundabout would operate acceptably with build out of planning area 1. And what we evaluated is full build out. So I project that sometime in between planning areas 1 and full build out, that would trigger the need for widening to 2-lane.
And who will pay for that?
Well, most likely it will be a developer-driven project unless the city is able to get grant funding or identify a capital project to help improve the intersection.
When you say a developer-driven project, which developer?
Well, the developer of the project, whoever builds out the development entity that is planning areas 2 and 3 and the PCI plan.
I'd like to talk about your analysis of traffic to the northwest of the project. It sounded to me like you agreed that roughly 20% of the traffic from the project will be carried on those roads to the northwest. Did I understand you correctly?
Yeah, that came from Fair and Pierre's traffic model. And as I reviewed that, with an understanding of traffic patterns in the area, 20% seemed reasonable.
But you didn't do any LOS analysis to the northwest, did you?
No, we did not.
Because
Not
King
northwest of the Tokel roundabout.
Right, because King County never asked for it, right?
Correct.
Did King County affirmatively tell you not to conduct analysis to the northwest?
They did not. No, they did not.
And in the King County comment letter from Jim Chan, did the county supply any analysis of traffic patterns or LOS to the northwest?
No, not to my knowledge.
To the best of your knowledge, has anybody conducted that analysis?
Well, the areas of 202 and 203 to the northwest are pretty significant because they carry all the way to Redmond and Carnation and Falls City. So I'm aware of, personally and professionally aware of, several development projects that have evaluated levels of service along those corridors. So if that helps answer your question, I know that they have been studied as part of other traffic studies.
Are you planning to study traffic impacts to the northwest during later phases of this project, like phase 2 or 3?
Am I personally, or is our firm? Is that what you're asking?
You or your firm, anybody?
Yeah. I believe it's appropriate to have future analysis of phases 2 and 3 as time occurs and traffic grows and more refinements are done with planning areas 2 and 3. I believe is appropriate for additional analysis to be conducted at a minimum within the study area that was evaluated previously. If it's in the interests of the city and the county to expand that study area, we certainly would be available to evaluate that if that's what's required.
Do you think it is in the interests of the city or the county to evaluate the traffic to the northwest, given the fact that 20% of the traffic will be on those roads?
It's hard for me to speak on their behalf of what is in their interests.
Do you think it's in the public's interest to evaluate traffic on those roads, given that 20% of the project traffic will be on those roads?
Yes.
And when do you think it would be appropriate for that analysis to occur?
Well, the 2 points that make the most sense to me is when a more formal application comes in for what is identified as planning areas 2 and 3 separately. So in a more modified site plan that will certainly be submitted for a variety of, for a number of different review elements, that would be the appropriate time to reevaluate.
But I
think.
take it you think now is not the appropriate time.
Can you rephrase? Now is not the appropriate time for what?
Yeah, to conduct traffic analysis on those roads to the northwest of the project that will carry 20% of the traffic. Now is not the appropriate time to evaluate that.
It's hard for me to answer when is now the appropriate time.
Yeah, you said later was the appropriate time. I'm asking, what about now?
I see. Let me clarify. What I was saying is what I thought the question was, and what I was trying to say is the appropriate time to reevaluate intersection level service and impacts of planning areas 2 and 3 would be when more formal applications are submitted for those. Whether that includes the same study area of 23 intersections or beyond is still to be determined.
All right. In your analysis, how much truck traffic did you allocate to Mill Pond Road?
That's a good question. If you still have that exhibit, Mr. Seidels, that had the pass by number,
Yeah, actually I do.
that would help me answer that question much more quickly.
So we're going back to
If you want to know a percentage, I can tell you that now. If you want to know the number of trucks, I would need that exhibit.
I'm interested in them both. So let's do the exhibit. All right. So here's that same page, PDF 815 of Appendix F to the draft EIS.
Yes. So if you would be willing to move that, either reduce or move it a little bit to the right. Yeah. So we haven't testified to this portion of the table yet, but I can now. And just for context, for the record, this is a table, an exhibit that estimates traffic generation for planning area 1. And the total traffic generation is, after accounting for internal capture and pass by trips, the total, what we call net new generation, is on the bottom line. It's kind of in a light blue. The total vehicular traffic generation that's estimated for planning area 1 is 5,768 trips. What the columns on the right represent is the approximate estimate of how much of that total traffic would be trucks and how much would be vehicles. Now, what this tells us is that the project is of the total traffic generation, it's estimated to generate about 251 trucks, and with the remainder being vehicles.
Yeah, but my question was, how many trucks specifically on Mill Pond Road did you allocate?
100% of them.
All trucks are going to Mill Pond Road?
Yes.
Why would the truck ever take some other road?
Well, the trucks are identified to be headed out to the Tokel roundabout into 202. The truck traffic that would be projected for a site like this would be trucks that are, when the project is built, for example, when the industrial park, which could have a variety of uses, manufacturing uses, products, right, or bringing trucks in and out, would all come in our projection from State Route 202. That could be coming from the east, from the west, Snoqualmie Parkway, but they all have to get out to 202 via Mill Pond Road. And the majority of the trucks would be from the industrial portion. There may be some trucks that are generated, or in fact, there will be some trucks that are generated by the retail portion. They may use the Mill Street access, but all of them eventually have to come to and from Mill Pond Road.
Okay, thank you. Have you ever seen a construction management plan included in an EIS? I
have not seen a detailed construction management plan included in EIS, I commonly see either a general description or a reference to a construction management plan.
Not ever. You've seen the actual CMP included in the EIS, not even one time in your entire career.
In my career, I've probably done 6 or 7 EISs, so the sampling isn't significant. But the ones that I've done, again, in my experience in the EIS, is that the details of a construction management plan are not typically included at that point.
Okay, thank you. Did you include construction traffic from phase 2 in your analysis of traffic for phase 1? And that question might be a little bit unclear. You look puzzled by this question. Let me try to clarify what I'm getting at. So phase 1 is going to be built first, and you've done some traffic modeling for phase 1. Later on, phase 2 will be built. While they're building phase 2, there's going to have to be construction traffic, right? Otherwise, how are you going to build phase 2? Does your modeling of the traffic for phase 1 include that construction traffic that will be added on top of it when they start working on phase 2?
No, we did not specifically model that condition.
How are they supposed to build phase 2 without construction traffic?
Well, they would have construction traffic with phase 2.
But you don't know what the impacts of that will be.
We as part of this EIS analysis, we focused on built conditions when planning area 1 is completed and the full development of the PCI plan. We did not do any interim evaluation of the specific condition that you suggested.
Okay. When you, and this is my last question actually, when you were talking about the transit analysis that you did do, you provided a recital of certain bus routes and shuttle routes in this area. Do you remember mentioning those?
I do.
Other than identifying the routes that exist, what other transit analysis did you do?
We did not do any other analysis of transit other than identifying the existing condition and documenting that there were no known future plans for extended or modified transit service in the area.
Will any of the users of this project, once it's built out, be making use of those transit lines that exist?
It's hard to say definitively, but I would expect that there may be some residents or employees or retail users that would use transit.
Why didn't you attempt to model that use?
Because I believe that the percentage likelihood of transit uses would be minimal.
What is your basis for that belief?
The fact that the transit service today is limited to one route that only serves a specific area. And there's not a high frequency of transit service into downtown Bellevue or downtown Seattle or linkages to other like East Side Rail facilities and things like that. There's just not enough service to be able to attract a noticeable demand for transit usage.
I understand that's your opinion, but I'm just asking what that's based off of. What information is that based off of?
It's based on my experience as a traffic engineer and my understanding of the limited transit service in the area. It's not based on a quantifiable calculation. It's based on my expertise and understanding of the site location.
Thank you. No further questions.
All right, thank you very much. Let's check in now with Mr. Karpman. Do we have some redirect for this witness?
I think we will. I will do my best to keep it brief. Good afternoon, Mr. Schramm.
Hello.
We've been speaking together for a while so far today.
It's been a great day.
Yeah, I agree. I'm having fun. Mr. Schramm, I do recall when you told me about the ethical standards that you follow as a transportation engineer.
Yes.
And do those standards apply to your analysis regardless of whether your client is a developer or a government?
It's the same.
Thank you. There was some discussion about, and I think I didn't ask about this in the most clear way initially, so I may have contributed to it, but your review of that 26% number and the additional data that came in. So I just want to try to quickly clear up the chronology. Mr. Norris referenced some data from a permanent traffic counter at SR 18 south of I-90. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then you said in the FEIS, and you and I talked about today, how you also looked at some permanent traffic recorder data. I don't know if that's the technical term, but something from a similar survey on a milepost on SR 202 northwest of the site, as well as on I-90. Is that correct?
Yes, we looked at permanent traffic recorders. I think you got it right. You've been hanging out with traffic engineers too long. Permanent traffic recorders, we reviewed the 3 locations that were available in the general area, one of which was the same location that Mr. Norris identified on State Route 18. One of them was in the vicinity on Interstate 90, and one was further west on State Route 202.
Okay, and did any of the 3 of those contribute to your initial traffic count calculations in the DEIS or your LOS conclusions?
Can you clarify what you mean by initial?
Your conclusions in the DEIS about existing conditions, LOS, I guess, traffic volumes and levels of service at study area intersections. Were those conclusions informed by your review of any of those 3 permanent traffic recorders?
No, they were not.
Okay, and so after you completed your conclusions in the DEIS, did you review Mr. Norris's comment letter talking about the SR 18 permanent traffic recorder?
Yes, I did.
And then in light of Mr. Norris's comments about that permanent traffic recorder, did you then review the data from the other 2 permanent traffic recorders to further evaluate the basis for Mr. Norris's statements?
Yes.
And then did those inform your statements in the FEIS?
Yes, they did.
Your testimony today?
Yeah. Yes, they did, along with the additional traffic count data that we had requested and received from the city for Snoqualmie Parkway.
Thank you. Mr. Seidels, I believe that latter amount of data, so that's yet another set of information, but that was to review the potential for variance between weekday and weekend traffic on Snoqualmie Parkway. Is that correct?
Sorry, I was looking at
the historic traffic counts from the city of Snoqualmie is separate from those 3 permanent traffic recorders information that we talked about earlier.
I just want to make sure I think my answer is yes.
I'm not making good sentences here.
Well, I want to make sure we get it right. So ask it again, please.
Talking about the three PTRs, SR 18, 202, and I-90. That's one thing. And then you just said you also looked at historic traffic count data from Snoqualmie Parkway that was provided by the city of Snoqualmie.
Yes.
Right. And that last piece of data was to look specifically at the variation between weekend and weekday traffic.
No, it was used for 2 purposes, one of which was to review the variation of traffic between months, but it was also used to review the traffic counts during peak. It was also used to review and determine whether the 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and the 4 to 6 p.m. time periods were accurate and legitimate to substantiate the time periods that we chose were reflective of actual peak hour conditions on Snoqualmie Parkway.
Thank you for clarifying that. I'm sorry. And by substantiate, you mean that was also a set of data that you looked at after reviewing comments on the DEIS?
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Seidels, I believe, said regarding that last data that you have nothing to show us to back up your description of it other than your testimony right now. Do you recall a statement to that effect?
Yes, I said I have the data, but it's not, or I can provide, I have the data because that's what we viewed, but it's not in the record currently.
Thank you. And you are under oath?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. looking through my notes. I think we basically, I don't want to belabor the issue of pass-by trips. It's as we said in your direct testimony, it sounds like you and Mr. Norris have a disagreement about the definition of what trip can be classified as a pass-by trip. Would that be fair?
Yeah, it sounds like there's some different interpretation.
Okay, and then just to confirm, your testimony was, regardless of whether Mr. Norris agrees with what is described in the chart that Mr. Seidels and I both showed you as a pass-by trip, that all of the trips generated by the site, no matter how they are classified, are included in your traffic impact analysis. Is that correct?
Yes, the pass-by trips are included in the traffic analysis.
And that includes both what I suppose Mr. Norris would call a pass-by trip, as well as what you referred to as a diverted trip.
Yes, it's the same trips. How they're classified or how they're termed is a little bit different. What I explained is where they are coming to and from.
And so regardless of whether Mr. Norris agrees with what has arrived in that chart as the net new trips generated by the project as a raw number, again, all of the trips are included in your actual impact analysis. Is that right?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. A fair amount of discussion of pedestrian, bike, and transit trips. Is a strategy to encourage pedestrian, bikes, and transit trips something that you would consider an environmental impact?
No, a strategy is not an impact.
Thank you. And then just at the end, you were talking about modeling transit use or predicting transit trips. Was it also your testimony earlier that you considered trip generation based on the ITE manual, and that had some information that you looked at regarding whether this site would be considered to generate transit trips?
Yes, we relied upon the IT trip generation manual.
Thank you. And that is all my questions. Thank you very much, Mr. Schramm.
All right. Just checking in, Mr. Seidels.
Nothing further.
Okay, thank you so much. Anything further from the city for this witness? No.
Thank you, Ms. Examiner.
All right, Mr. Schramm, thank you so much for spending the day with us and for your testimony. I think that I think council wants you to stick around for other traffic witnesses. I think the next witness is a traffic witness. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, I was muted. That is correct.
Yeah, so I think Mr. Schramm's already been placed back as an attendee. Do we want to proceed directly to the next witness at this time?
I am trying to determine if he has joined us.
Yeah, I'm not looking at the participants list myself.
Mr. Breland is an attendee, and so if he is ready, and unless the examiner needs another spinal break.
Nope, spine's good. That 15-minute break was just what the
All right,
doctor ordered.
then I see Mr. Breland has been promoted to a panelist, so
Great.
the examiner wants to proceed.
Yes, please. Let's go on ahead. If I could have you unmute, sir, and then state and spell your name. Give me your credentials or title, how I should identify you in the findings, and then let me swear you in.
All right, so my name is Chris Breland, and last name spelled Breeiland. I'm a professional civil engineer here, registered in Washington, a few other states. I'm a principal at Fair & Peers, a transportation consulting firm who has been the longtime on-call transportation engineering and planning firm for the city of Snoqualmie. I believe that's all you need.
That is. Let me please swear you in. If you would raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm your testimony will be true? If so, please say I do.
I do.
Okay, and then I don't know if you've been watching. I've instructed objecting attorneys to interrupt you. So please, when they do, please stop speaking so that we can address the objection.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Ms. Examiner. Good afternoon, Mr. Breland, and thanks for your patience through all the testimony today. Could you just tell us a little bit more about your background? How long have you been with Fair and Pierce?
I've been with Fair and Pierce for 17 years.
Okay, and how much work during that time have you done work for the city of Snoqualmie?
I've been working with the city of Snoqualmie since 2009 in very much a similar fashion to what I'm doing here, reviewing transportation studies and conducting a lot of the independent traffic planning and engineering work for the city.
Okay, and prior to your time at Fair and Pierce, were you also employed as a traffic engineer?
Yeah, so I was an engineer in training, as it's called, but I have a couple extra years of experience, so a total of 19 years.
Okay, thank you very much. And your education, I assume you have an engineering degree?
Yeah, so I have a planning degree from undergrad, and then a civil engineering degree graduate school.
All right, from which institutions?
UC Davis for undergraduate and UC Irvine for graduate school.
All right, thanks very much. And Ms. Examiner, city previously identified Mr. Braylon's resume as Exhibit C13, and just for record purposes, I'd move its admission.
I'm sorry, I keep forgetting. There's a lawnmower right outside, so I muted myself. I was checking for objections. I assume none, and thank you. It will be admitted.
All right, thank you, Ms. Examiner. So, Mr. Braylon, you were talking about your peer review experience in Snoqualmie. Did any of that involve review of proposed developments for Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2 or 2?
Yes, so I've done some follow-up studies on Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and several of the units of Snoqualmie Ridge 2, and further sort of infill projects that were not specifically identified on the initial plan.
Okay, and did Fair and Pierce peer review environmental impact statements for either Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2?
Yeah, so Fair and Pierce, not me personally, peer reviewed EISs for both of those developments.
Okay, so you peer reviewed EISs that were prepared by the developer in that case?
That's correct, yes.
Okay, and then your work has involved peer review of individual development projects within Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2?
That's correct, part of which for particularly the SR2 subsequent developments involved sort of a re-review and sort of revalidation, if you will, of the SR2 EIS findings for consistency, and also to ensure that those specific pieces that were being built were conforming with the analysis that was performed as part of those EISs.
Okay, and so did that happen with each implementing project, or did you review implementing projects as you went along, and at some point further in the build out process you did this revalidation review?
So we had a contract that was known as Snoqualmie Ridge Traffic Monitoring, which is an ongoing contract that wrapped up in around probably 2012 or so with the city, that did periodic traffic counts, largely on the Parkway and at the I-90 ramps, just to monitor how traffic was building up as those developments built out, to make sure that the forecasts were consistent with what was anticipated in the EIS, and probably more specifically to the development agreements that were sort of the resulting parts of those EISs, to make sure that everything was following the plan. In addition, as recently as 2020, we have been doing some traffic analysis, notably for the hospital that's located at 99th and the Parkway, to confirm traffic forecasts and expectations that did rely on the SR2 traffic analysis, again, for confirmation to determine whether or not the hospital was within the envelope of SR2 development scale. And so we've done a number of those sort of follow on that are not not related to the monitoring of the SR1 or 2 EISs, but relied on those documents as well.
Okay, just for, you mentioned an intersection, and I'll just take a moment to screen share here. This is exhibit M16, which Mr. Cartman was using earlier today, and you mentioned the hospital at 99th. Can you see the hand on the screen here?
Yes.
Ms. Examiner, can you see that?
Yes.
All right, and is this the intersection of, well, is this the hospital right here in the pink?
Yes, it is.
And in the intersection of the Parkway and 99th is where the hand is right now?
That is correct.
Okay, thank you. And when Mr. Schramm was testifying earlier, I think he talked several times about receiving data related to the Parkway and intersections from the city traffic count data. And Mr. Norris may have referenced that also. Was that the data that you were just describing that Fair and Piers has collected through the monitoring process?
Specifically, yeah, for Mr. Schramm, the data that he received originated from our work. I'm not 100% sure of all the data that Mr. Norris had received.
Okay. And so you mentioned also performing these sort of validation, or re-reviewing studies. What did those studies tell you about the prior traffic modeling that was done as part of SR1 and SR2 traffic analyses?
Yeah, so SR1 and SR2, they were analyzed in a very similar way to what the mill site is, just as way of context in terms of using ITE trip generation rates that were informed by the regional model to determine where those trips would ultimately go. And on the whole, as an industry, we consider those ITE rates conservative. In other words, they tend to be a little bit high. And as a background, they've been decreasing those rates as ITE updates the manual every few years. Those rates have been going down for about the past 20 years, just incrementally. People are making a little bit fewer trips, and therefore it was not a surprise to us as we're doing the review that the prior SR1 and 2, Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2 development EISs have a higher trip generation estimate and higher traffic volumes forecast on relevant area roadways than are actually present when we do any observation. And that has been consistent year in and year out, where those EISs are, from the context of an environmental disclosure document, conservative. And I expect that to continue to be the case, even though those developments are pretty well done at this point.
Okay, and so those documents, as you mentioned, were prepared by the applicant, peer reviewed by you or your firm. So in those cases, it was both the applicant's traffic engineering review and your peer review that was conservative, I think is the word you used. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. And then I should get back to the mill site here, which I will in a second. But so what has your role been with respect to review of the Snoqualmie mill site draft and final environmental impact statements?
Yeah, so as is typical, when these types of larger scale applications come in, the city engages us, typically their community development director or the public works director engages us to perform an independent review of kind of all the stages, everything from scoping to initial trip generation, all the way through the analysis of the work for these types of projects. And our role really is to represent the city on this and to make sure that impacts and the characterization of the development from a transportation perspective is accurate and will be in the best interest of the city. So in that case, this is what was occurring in this particular instance. So we reviewed and edited several early versions of the 10W work as it flowed out, often with comments that required changes or rework to make sure that we felt that they were studying sort of the right issues, right pieces of information. And again, to make sure that the city's requirements are met and ultimately the residents are served by the evaluation that the developer is carrying out.
Okay, thank you. That's a good summary. And before we go further, just to clarify some of the terms that have been used previously, there's the ITE manual, the trip generation manual that you referred to, and then there's a model. And can you explain the difference between the manual and models as far as with respect to sort of use of actual data versus trying to be predictive?
Yeah, so the ITE manual, I think, has been described pretty well. It's a collection of many hundreds, if not thousands, of observations of how many vehicles mostly are leaving different sites of land uses of all sorts and types. Going back clear back to the 60s, they've been collecting these data. And using that data and then doing some statistics on that, they're able to estimate how many trips will be generated from any sort of land use, from residential to industrial, and so forth. So that's the ITE trip generation manual. It's basically a big book of estimated vehicle trip generation rates that is an industry standard to use as a starting point for evaluation.
Okay, and so let me just stop you there for a second. So are the estimates essentially statistical averages based on
Yes.
past actual existing developments?
Yes, correct.
Okay, and then what's the difference between that and say the PSRC, the Puget Sound Regional Council model that has been referenced?
Yeah, so the Puget Sound Regional Council model is in essence a completely different animal in some respects. It has trip generation rates in the same fashion that I described from the ITE, and that's part of it. But what the Puget Sound Regional Council does is it takes a land use number, just like ITE does, estimates number of trips, but then it goes further and this essentially figures out what mode those trips will take. So be it on the bus or walking, biking, driving, and then where they go. So it does what they call distributes those trips to different locations and ultimately assigns those trips, just the vehicle and transit trips, mind you, to a specific road or transit route. So it's a more complete tool when you're trying to understand something more than just how many trips are generated and you want to know where they go. We routinely use the PSRC model for that role. And over the years, we've developed what we call a more detailed and refined version of that model for use in Snoqualmie. And incidentally, North Bend has also relied upon that same model for work that we've done for them as a municipality.
Okay, so for purposes of this conversation, is it accurate to call that the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, and can you speak a little bit more in detail about what those adjustments to the model have been?
Yeah, so this is something that we pretty routinely work with the planners at the city to make sure that we have the right base land use in the model. The PSRC is a big 4-county region with 4 million people in it. Their level of accuracy for the city of Snoqualmie is not perfect. And so we want to make sure that we have a more refined land use set of land use understanding within Snoqualmie and the surrounding region. We also thus coordinate with folks like North Bend as well for that information. And so the refinements that we work with the city on is getting that base year land use right, in addition to getting the forecasted land use correct. Models are not useful for, if you want to know what the traffic condition is today, you go and take a count or you look out the window. Models are all about predicting what's going on in the future. So getting that future land use forecast right is really important. And again, we work closely with the city to do that. In addition, again, North Bend is also a frequent partner in that, given the close relationship between the cities and also the tribes. Make sure that we understand what they're working on to get that background. So we've refined the land use. We've also refined some of how the what we call the network, which is the roads and transit lines in the model. When you open the model, it looks somewhat like a map. It's not as detailed as a map, but it's got all those roads and links in there. So we make sure that those are defined correctly for both the existing condition and that future condition, so that the ultimate travel patterns that the model estimates are accurate to the degree that such a large tool can be.
Okay, and you mentioned having information adjustments related to projected future land use growth in Snoqualmie. Did you have detailed information about expected growth rates from city planners that you factored into the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, and there's some reference in the EIS to a TAZ. Is that the adjusted information that you're talking about?
Yeah, and just to clarify, a TAZ is an element of the model. It's a traffic analysis zone or transportation analysis zone, TAZ. And so we reviewed all of those with city staff to make sure that the right amount of land use was both there under existing and future conditions.
Okay, and if you've seen Mr. Norris's comment letter, I think you said, and did you have a chance to watch or hear the recording of his testimony?
I watched most of the relevant pieces of his testimony, but I may have missed something.
Okay. Well, are you aware generally of his criticism of the use of the PSRC model and his contention that there should have been a separate Snoqualmie model created?
Yes, I am aware of that.
And can you respond to that?
Yeah, so we and just as a background, I am a travel demand forecasting as a background. That's what I got my degree specifically in. I work within our research and development group on travel demand forecasting, have been doing so for nearly 20 years. So I'm quite familiar with the sort of different types and ways to do travel demand forecasting. The idea of developing a sub-area, what we would call a sub-area model for the city of Snoqualmie, is notable, but I would say there's some significant reasons why it's not necessarily appropriate in this case. A lot of the work that we did to help sort of define and review the 10W work would be exactly duplicative if what we were to do for a sub-area model. Sub-area models are still created from the regional model as a whole. They still require detailed land use review, much as we did for the city of Snoqualmie. And in fact, they pull a lot of the information from the regional model to understand where do the trips get distributed regionally, what is the regional background trip growth, et cetera. So effectively, to create a sub-area model, we would be reproducing in a much more complex and time-intensive manner the same data that was shared with 10W to do what we term as a manual trip generation and distribution overlay on top of the Snoqualmie refined version of the model. So I understand Mr. Norris's point, but it's, in my opinion, complete overkill for something like this, given that all the relevant information that we already shared would be part of a Snoqualmie sub-area model. But to get that model to work at a level to meet industry standards, there'd have to be household surveys, business surveys, a whole host of other data collection pieces that frankly are not necessary for an EIS and are very atypical for these types of analyses.
Would there be significant time and expense involved in creating a separate standalone Snoqualmie model?
Yes, absolutely. We wrapped up a standalone model development for the city of Redmond that supports their comprehensive plan update just recently, and have recently done something similar for the city of Kent. While those are larger cities, the actual level of effort to do a standalone model is, doesn't matter as much about how big the city is. It's just how much data you need to go out, collect, and time that it takes to calibrate and validate those tools.
And would you have expected if you were able to spend that time and spend that money to develop a standalone model, would you expect it to produce any different result than the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model used here?
From the frame of, would it come to a different conclusion for the significance of transportation impacts from the mill site? No, I don't view that it would have made any difference in that perspective.
And you were talking about the monitoring and validation data that you've collected over the years. Does that tell you anything about the success of the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model in accurately predicting traffic impacts or distribution and impacts?
Yeah, so from just again, and the model's adjusted continuously over time, and so it is set to match the distribution patterns that are out there. And in looking back at the SR2's development in particular, the trip generation estimates that were done for that EIS, they were high. They were conservative, so they're a fair bit higher than what we're actually seeing out there today. The overall pattern of travel very closely mirrors those, as it was mentioned earlier, those percentages of distribution of people coming and going from the city. That pattern was well reflected, and I'll just say that's not so much a pat on our back. That's a pat on the fact that we're relying on Puget Sound Regional Council's model for that basic overall regional traffic pattern. Was done so for SR2. Same instance was applied here for the mill site. I'm relying on the regional tool for where it does best, which is sort of that regional distribution and depiction of what's going on.
Okay, and does the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model, does that include background traffic growth, or is that something that you add as a separate part of the analysis?
No, it includes that. And in fact, that's one of the most, I think, sort of relevant uses of that model, is to understand what is the background traffic growth looking forward. Looking forward is different than looking backward in terms of looking at how much growth we would expect in the future. Okay, and you said something about your re-review work confirming that the prior analyses had been conservative. Were they conservative?
Alexi, my name is Dave Bricklin. I have a
Excuse me, Mr. Bricklin, you're unmuted and we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Examiner. You were referring, Mr. Braylon, to the prior Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2 analyses as being conservative, and were they conservative with respect to assumptions about background traffic growth? And if so, can you describe in more detail by how much? Yeah, so they weren't necessarily conservative in the terms of the background traffic growth. For Snoqualmie Ridge 1 and 2, the dominant piece of information is actually the development of those communities, because they are so large. They almost wash out the background growth. They are the background growth in some respects, but the trip generation estimates were high, to the tune of the actual traffic volumes we see on the road are about 60% of the estimated or forecast volumes that we had, that those EISs had estimated at the time. So they predicted a significantly more traffic than actually was occurring, which is why we don't see a lot of, for example, gridlock within the ridge area itself. There's busy times and places that was expected, but it's a lot of times those roads are a little bigger than maybe they needed to be. Okay. And so what, in the case of the mill site EIS, what was the background traffic growth rate assumed in the analysis? The background traffic growth rate was assumed as 1% for all roadways except for Snoqualmie Parkway. There's a reason for that. We assumed 0.5% on the Parkway. If you want me to elaborate, I'd be happy to. But sure, please. Okay. Because I was just going to ask you, I think Mr. Norris in particular was critical of that background growth rate. And he said that it ought to be higher and it ought to correspond to historical population growth. So yeah, if you can explain why you used the 1% and 0.5% and maybe address Mr. Norris's comments.
Yeah, so there's a lot of context that goes into setting or defining the background growth rates. So the area that we start with is looking at what is the model, again, the Snoqualmie sort of refined PSRC model estimate for the background growth rates. And those numbers, 1% and 0.5%, are for the most part what the model was predicting. It varies here and there. Some roads were a little bit above 1%, some were a little bit below 1%, but for the sake of trying to not create an overly convoluted evaluation process for the EIS, 1% was selected. When doing that, we always go back and double check what's going on those roadways to begin with. And so we have a pretty good set of data that goes back to 2007 on the Parkway and on SR 202. Principally, those are kind of the two big roads in the city. And for the Parkway, traffic volumes have gone down slightly since 2007. So there were around 8,500 or so on an average weekday in 2007. Our most recent counts have that a little bit closer to 8,000, which is not, again, a surprise as those areas have built out. And so we expect some stability there. On Highway 202, over that same period, the growth rate was 1.2% per year, and so pretty much in line with what our version of the PSRC model was forecasting. So we felt comfortable, again, that as the region fills up a bit more, we don't expect an accelerating growth rate, and that number was in line with the historic growth rates, even though Snoqualmie itself is coming off a pretty rapid build out of the Ridge 1 and 2 over time. So that was a validation, if you will, of what we expect to see in the future moving forward.
So would it be appropriate or inappropriate in your view to do as maybe it was Mr. Drudowski who suggested that the city use the population growth rate from 2010 to 2017 and just apply that directly to traffic growth?
Yeah, again, there's a variety of reasons why that I would view that to be inappropriate. For one, the evidence on the roads themselves do not bear that out at all. There's a number of reasons why population growth and traffic growth are not necessarily tied at the hip. And we have empirical data that suggests that to be absolutely true. And moreover, like I mentioned, population growth, the city of Snoqualmie is getting to be towards a build out position under most of the land except for around the mill site. And so assuming that that pace of growth would continue into the future is not, there's no reason to carry that forward. You'd grossly overstate how much traffic there would be. Moreover, looking at the surrounding communities, particularly towards the north, there's not a lot of development in King County. King County is not in the business of permitting a lot of growth. While there is growth in North Bend, that's why we use a model to determine where is that traffic going to go. It's impacting Snoqualmie, certainly. That's part of that 1% background growth, but it's not to the tune of the historic growth in the area.
Okay, thank you. And there was some, did you hear Mr. Seidel's questions to Mr. Schramm over the last hour or so?
I did, yes.
Okay, and he was querying Mr. Schramm about did he or did he not look at weekends and why didn't he, and was the city interested or not interested? And so were you involved in conversations with 10W about review of weekends, and can you speak to that and the rationales for any decisions that were made?
Yeah, no, a good question from Mr. Seidel as to why the weekends were not sort of evaluated in a more discrete level. And that was something that we asked 10W to help us answer during the pre-scoping, if you will, of this project. Mr. Schramm did note that the EIS has an estimate of Saturday trip generation because of the recreational uses in there. We were curious about that. And we asked for that information just to understand if the weekend uses are a fairly significant trip generator, then we were going to be wanting to understand what the potential impacts are. But as it turned out, the weekend trip generation forecast from Mr. Schramm and his group was about 26% lower than the weekday trip generation, which is pretty typical when we look at these types of studies. We
can I just stop you there for a second and screen share, because I don't remember if Mr. Seidels did this with Mr. Schramm on this particular topic, but this is draft environmental impact. Can you see that on the screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. This is exhibit 3.11-19 from the draft EIS, and for those using the PDF, it's PDF page 395. Is this that comparison of counts that you just referred to, that you asked 10W to collect?
That is correct, yes.
Okay, and so you were starting to say, I think 26% difference approximately. Is that reflect what numbers would you look at in this table to come to that conclusion?
It's that total trips, that final column, just comparing the Saturday daily trip estimate versus the weekday daily trip estimate.
So it would be this total as compared to this total?
That is correct.
Okay, and for the record, I just highlighted the top line total trips weekday daily, far right hand column of the exhibit, and then Saturday daily, which is far right hand column, the lowest line. But go ahead, please, Mr. Braylon.
So when we in evaluating that clearly the trip generation is quite a bit lower on the Saturday period than the weekday period. We did not request that there be a specific evaluation of the background or just the general traffic counts along those roadways on the weekend versus the weekday. And that is because, and this is, a bit of maybe us using engineering judgment, as we love to say in the field, the fact that in our opinion, the difference in weekend traffic is very unlikely to outstrip that difference in trip generation from weekend to weekday. We've done a lot of these studies around the region and across the country as a firm, and the weekend trip generation rate has to be substantially higher, to the tune of 30, 40, 50% higher to start to generate more of an impact than what you tend to see during the critical AM and PM peak hours from background traffic. So those are almost always the controlling factors when determining the whether or not there's a traffic related impact. And so this data point in our mind said, well, this is not something that we would expect to generate an undisclosed traffic impact, given that the weekend trip generation rates are so much lower than the weekday.
And what are well, let me ask this another way. Are there trips missing on the weekend that help account for that significant difference? For example, commuting trips and school trips?
Yeah, there's a couple factors. So exactly right. There's a lot more what we call a lot fewer non-discretionary is the wonky term for that, trips on the weekend, and those are things like commuting and school. So things that people can't just sort of, if you got to go to work. These days are maybe a little bit different. Who knows what the post-COVID world brings to it? But that's a big difference as to why we see even just most of the time background trip travel is quite a bit lower on weekends than weekdays. The exception to the rule are things like around a ski area or something like that have a very heavy recreational aspect. But even though people may view sort of Snoqualmie Valley as a recreational center and whatnot, it's still predominantly residential. And so that's why those trips are lower. And I guess I'll make one other kind of fine point. The peak hour, the weekday peak hours are more pronounced. In other words, less spread out than the weekend. And again, that has to do with discretionary trips. People have to pick up their kids at a specific time. You can go to the grocery store whenever you, well, I shouldn't say that, but you have more latitude as to when you can do some of those, not the discretionary trips that tend to occur more so on the weekend. So the peak is what we call flatter.
Okay. You mentioned seeing similar results in comparing weekday peak to weekend. Were there any significant projects, in the Puget Sound region where one might expect to see a more pronounced weekend impact where you didn't see it?
Well, so just as by way of example, we recently wrapped up the EIS for the Key Arena or Climate Pledge Arena rebuild over in Seattle, and we did a weekend analysis in that event, and even with that, and that's got a significant recreational component around Seattle Center and whatnot. Even with fuller events that were programmed on the weekend and weekday, that still did not. The PM peak hour was still the factor, even though we did a more extensive weekend evaluation in that instance.
Okay. So it was the combination of your experience with projects like that, and both regionally and nationally, and this confirmation of the local data in Exhibit 3.11-19 that led you to give the direction to 10W to keep the focus on the weekday peak versus weekend?
That is correct.
Okay. Mr. Seidels also spent some time chatting with Mr. Schramm about seasonal differences, summer versus winter, and in particular the counts at SR18. Can you respond to that, to both to Mr. Norris's criticism there and Mr. Seidels' questioning?
So there are seasonal differences in traffic, and I think no one's disputing that. I think what's up for debate is whether or not the degree of seasonality would lead us to an undisclosed traffic impact in this case. The seasonal information, the most recent information we have is from 2007 on seasonality in and around the some of the roadways that are there. So it's a bit out of date, but the seasonality effects are sort of in the range as to what was described by the different permanent traffic count recorders that are using much more recent data than this 2007 data that was collected systematically over a number of months in service of the Snoqualmie Ridge monitoring. So I can only speak to the fact of I've heard the testimony on those ends. The permanent traffic count recorder data stations are all in the vicinity of, but none specifically on the facility in question. And so it was not something in our peer review that we had specifically cited. And that's in part because the nature of the environmental impact statement is requesting that impacts be disclosed, but also that they be disclosed under typical conditions. For the most part, and in most every EIS that I've been part of, we look at a midweek day, as it's called, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, when school is in session, as the factor that we're trying to be planning for. We don't look for the day after Thanksgiving around a shopping center, and we're also not looking at sort of Christmas Day for a new development. Those are extremes that we're not trying to look at. And so in looking at the data that was collected, it was, again, midweek when school's in session, and we determined that to follow standard care, state of the practice evaluation techniques. Okay,
so state of the practice here is, contrary to what Mr. Norris said, would not be to do a worst case scenario.
Yes, in my opinion, if we're trying to plan for the worst case scenario, that's not necessarily in the best interest of of the public, because that leads to, you know, wider roads, more environmental impact from sort of trying to accommodate the worst case scenario. So what we want to do is make sure that on a day-to-day basis, understand what are people likely to expect, what are the city's expect standards for that, and disclose what needs to be done if those standards are not met.
Okay, so was it reasonable then, in your view, for the 10W analysis to not separately analyze level of service impacts for based on seasonal differences?
Yes, I would concur with that.
Okay, thank you. Since we were just in the vicinity, talking into the vicinity of I-90, I asked Mr. Schramm a few questions about temporary improvements to the I-90 Snoqualmie Parkway interchange. Are you familiar with those?
Yes, I am.
Can you describe briefly what those improvements were and when they were constructed?
Yeah, so the improvements were to take the southbound right turn lane that goes from the Parkway onto I-90. It's westbound, so that's the one of the heavy movements, particularly in the morning. And it was to take it from being controlled by the traffic signal. So people used to have to wait for a green light or a gap in traffic to make that right turn, and to completely separate that movement from the control of the traffic signal, so that cars do not have any delay caused by the signal at that location anymore. That change was made in 2019. I don't remember the exact month or whatever, but it was after the initial analysis was done for this EIS.
Okay, and did that improvement have any impact on level of service, in your opinion?
It did. I don't have, like Mr. Schramm, I don't have a specific calculation of what the level of service change was, because that's we were never asked to do that. But we do have, in part of those hospital reviews, we've done 3 of them to date. One of the things that we did look at was queuing from the Parkway that could potentially interfere with that intersection that you had your hand over at 99th, because that's an important access to the hospital. And we can see a pretty big difference before and after that turn lane was put in there, in terms of how far and how much time that traffic backed up the Parkway. So there's significantly less delay. We can see it, but I just don't have a number as to how much different it is.
Okay, so it's reasonable. Is it reasonable to conclude that the level of service at that intersection, as we sit here today, is better than described in the DEIS analysis?
Yes.
Okay, and would you characterize that as a minor difference or a significant difference?
It's a significant difference.
Okay, thank you. Let's see, Mr. Norris and Mr. Schramm both spoke at length about pass-by trips and internal capture and diverted link, and I won't take you into all of the depths of that. But Mr. Norris had some criticism for references to use of what he said was a proprietary model, that MXD plus, and that there was no documentation that it was valid, and in his view that it looked like, you know, a trick to paint a rosier picture. Can you speak about the MXD plus tool, what it was, and respond to Mr. Norris's comments, please?
Yeah, no. So what that tool is, he did get the sort of the origin story of that right. It was developed on behalf of the United States Environmental Protection Agency, because they were concerned they were seeing too many EISs being challenged, particularly mixed use development EIS like this, where there's housing and office and retail and whatnot mixed together. Too many EISs being challenged by opponents of the developments on the grounds that they generated too much traffic and they shouldn't be allowed. And part of the issue is that the traditional methods to do the evaluation struggled to understand how many trips between the different types of uses. And it's not, again, as Mr. Schramm pointed out, it's not sort of the retail to retail interaction. That's handled sort of in the way that the ITE, for example, deals with that. And I will say it is not handled in the PSOC model by itself, which is why we always do these secondary trip generation estimates for site-specific applications, but that's a separate issue. So the amount of trips that mix between, say, an office and a retail area that has restaurants in it wasn't well established. So EPA hired us to develop a new model. We did it in conjunction with the University of Utah. It was peer reviewed by the American Society of Civil Engineers and the American Planning Association. All the calculations and details were submitted to both of those journals for scrutiny and publication. So it's a proprietary model in the sense that we own sort of the software that crunches the numbers, but anybody could look at the data and build their own version of these tools. But it was peer reviewed and found to be provide an accurate representation of internalization, and we wanted to validate it not just at a handful of sites. The ITE's method is good, but it's only validated at about 6 or 8 sites out of Florida. We wanted more, so we did 250 odd sites around the country, including about 15 or so in the Puget Sound area. It's been validated, it's been peer reviewed, and we feel it's very appropriate to use in this specific example and is superior to the really regional approach that the PSRC model uses. And it's noted that Mr. Norris had said that we shouldn't be using national tools when we have a locally sort of developed tool in the PSRC model. And I think it's important to note that the PSRC model is a really large-scale regional tool, again, covering 4 counties, and its primary job that the PSRC developed it for is to help develop the metropolitan transportation plan. So like, should we widen a freeway or not? Or what happens if Sound Transit builds a bunch of new light rail lines? And what happens if to air quality if we do all these things? That's the intended purpose of the tool. It is really not off the shelf developed for evaluation for a small site like the mill site. And so that's why we have these secondary tools to help understand at a very microscopic level what's going on, so that we can make further adjustments to tools like the PSRC tool. And so I view that as a very appropriate use of a peer-reviewed tool. And again, as was getting back to the point, what do we use it for? We used it to confirm whether or not the internalization calculations that 10W did were reasonable to move forward with. And the answer is they weren't exactly what MXD would predict, but they were within reason. And our job was not to sort of tell 10W how to do their work. It was, is it reasonable for the purposes of disclosing an impact? And we felt that their work was adequate as validated through this independent method.
Okay, thank you. And you said a lot there, so just let me try to ask a couple questions to summarize what you said. So Mr. Norris said that MXD Plus was not peer reviewed, and in fact it was. Is that correct?
Correct. Yes.
All right. And Mr. Norris, I think, said the MXD model plus model did not appear to be validated. Was that correct?
I think his criticism more aptly was that it was not, it was validated using national data, and that was not as good as local data. But it's true that it was validated with national data, but just like the PSRC, it uses some local data as well.
So it was validated using both. Was it validated using both local and national data?
That is correct.
All right. And in your application of the MXD Plus tool, you concluded, or did you conclude that the 10W internalization analysis was reasonably accurate?
Yes, we did.
Okay, thank you. I apologize for my questions. I hear counsel getting ready to object, and so I'm trying to ask you good questions. Let's see. Let me take you to you were talking about specific collecting data through the traffic monitoring process and so on. Have you also had occasion during your work in Snoqualmie for Fair and Peers to see traffic count data and analyses produced by developers or other traffic engineers?
Yes.
Okay, and do those typically include counts and application of peak hour periods?
Yes.
Okay, and I'm going to screen share here for a moment. And I am going to show the witness what has been marked as Exhibit S21. Have you seen this this report, which is titled Traffic Signal Justification, Snoqualmie Parkway, Fisher Avenue?
Yes, I have.
Okay, and who is it prepared by?
It was prepared by Mr. Norris, from my
Okay.
understanding, and that's his company at least.
Right. And I'm going to scroll to, pardon for the dizziness.
And Mr. Sturbank, just so I'm clear, this is the exhibit that the developer moved to strike from the record?
This is the exhibit that, no, you earlier suggested that it be stricken, and I asked that the examiner await a decision on that because it might be the subject of conversation with city witnesses.
Well, let's hear from the developer. Did they move for it to be stricken?
I'm sorry. I think the examiner gets to resolve questions here.
I didn't understand that. I didn't hear your last comment, Mr. Seidels.
Yes, thank you. Hold on, I'm trying to get my video to go. As I understood the motion to strike, the developer specifically called out this exhibit as something that they wanted stricken from the record. I agreed that it should be, just making sure I have that procedural history correct.
Well, Mr. Cartman?
I was just going to say, I believe the applicant, it was Ms. Kaler, included this on a list of exhibits that had not been the subject of testimony by the appellant, and that therefore would not be in the record. There was no specific objection to this exhibit or substantive objection to it.
And in our earlier procedural conversation when we got here, that was my understanding as well of why why it was up for suggestion or discussion. And the only person that specifically moved to strike the document, I thought, was you, Mr. Seidels.
Oh, I thought they wanted it gone and I was agreeing with them. All right, well, if they want it, very well.
Okay.
I'd just like to ask the witness some questions about it.
Okay.
All right, so I'm showing on the screen here, this is page small, I believe it's page 1. Let me just confirm that it is. And ask Mr. Braylon to look at the first sentence there under methodology and look at that the first sentence there. Does that tell you, I'm sorry, I am pointing you to the wrong sentence, sorry. First sentence in the second paragraph under methodology, do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And does that indicate to you that the study was prepared using counts and PM periods determined by the consultant?
Yes.
Okay. And then that rest of the paragraph explains how that data was analyzed. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then I'm going to scroll a little bit further here and look at the description. And do you see under the heading traffic volumes under the bold heading?
I do, yes.
What were the peak periods used in the analysis of this report?
So the peak hours that were used, and this is related to these traffic signal warrants, is 7 to 8, as noted there, and 4:30 to 5:30, based off of an 8-hour volume profile, as noted.
Okay. And did you hear Mr. Norris's testimony the other day that he said that he had prepared some analyses in Snoqualmie, but he had only ever used a 6:30 to 8:30 peak period in the AM? Is that what you heard?
I read the transcript. That was my understanding of such.
Okay. And so based on this exhibit, is that correct or incorrect?
Well, I think the piece that would be more telling is actually in the appendix, because the this notes the peak hour, not necessarily the broader peak period, which was, I believe, the piece that was under question, that the 7 to 9 peak period that was used to collect data for the mill site study was left open the possibility that the peak started earlier.
Okay, and I'm gonna have you look at what's Appendix B to the report. Which are these the counts that were used in determining the peak period?
From the best I can determine, that is the case.
And what was the 2-hour period looked at in the AM?
But it would include the 7 to 9 period in addition to all those other midday hours.
Okay, and was use of the 7 to 9 period appropriate under standard traffic engineering practices, in your opinion?
Yes.
And is that the same AM peak period utilized for the Snoqualmie Mill EIS?
It is, yes.
Okay, thanks. I'll stop sharing there. And I'll move admission of S21 on that basis, Ms. Examiner.
Ms. Examiner, I believe you're muted. The applicant has no objection.
Thank you. And appellants?
We have no objection.
Okay, we'll admit S21.
And I am close to wrapping up here. So Mr. Braylon, you described your peer review process here for the Snoqualmie Mill EIS. Have you served as peer reviewer on other projects where the 10W firm did the initial traffic analyses?
Yes, I have in a number of jurisdictions, including Snoqualmie.
Okay, and have you worked with Mr. Schramm in that context as well?
I believe this is the first time I've worked with Mr. Schramm under that context.
Okay, and in your view, did Mr. Schramm and 10W apply over these various topics that we've discussed here, the modeling, the trip generation, background growth, internal capture, and so on? Did Mr. Schramm and 10W apply appropriate professional traffic engineering standards?
Yes, they did. And we, as Mr. Schramm pointed out, there was a lot of collaboration over this, and that maybe is a kind speak for us providing a critical review and their being responsive to and discussing our concerns throughout the process, and ultimately getting to a point where I can confidently answer that the EIS is prepared in a sort of a very what we would consider to be a meeting all the professional standards necessary for this type of review.
And did it provide a reasonably thorough analysis of both the existing conditions and potential traffic impacts of the various Snoqualmie Mill alternatives evaluated in the EIS?
Yes, it did.
And did you hear Mr. Norris's comments at various points in the testimony that the analysis was produced an overly rosy outcome?
Yes, I heard that terminology, yes.
And do you have a response or an opinion about the validity of that statement?
I do not agree that the analysis produced an overly rosy outcome, and in particular in light of the fact that the trip generation, which was under much scrutiny of this study, which includes all the pass by and internalization and other pieces, I believe is conservatively high. In other words, it's going to tend to overestimate impacts. That's evidenced by our work over the years on the other major development projects in the city. And also in doing all this work, the trip generation numbers we scrutinized from the get-go. We do, as you mentioned, have a version of the PSRC model available that we use to help influence this whole piece. We did run the full land use profile within that model and determined that it produced similar results as what the final 10W estimates were. And again, it's not in the role of our relationship as peer reviewer, we are not we're not the dictator of how things are to be corrected or done. We're there to provide our advice. If we would have saw that their work was quite a bit off from our work with the PSRC model, we would have noted that and asked them to come up with some revisions or explanations. The fact of the matter is that we didn't do that, and therefore we view that their results were consistent to, again, if this were to be done in a much more complex, time-intensive manner with a sub-area model, why I'm quite confident in us not finding any specifically different conclusions. There's an evidence to that in that we were reviewing the model as we went along.
Okay, and in that respect, I think one of the criticisms about not using a sub-area model was that I think the comment was that it was unreasonable to compare uses or trips to Redmond or Woodinville or other areas like that. Do you have an opinion about that comment?
Yeah. So a little bit of the background. So in the EIS, the use of data from, say, Redmond and Woodinville was to help answer the kind of the unique nature of this project, in that there's these industrial uses here going to be located in a relatively expensive, affluent city. Where might those people who work in those types of industries live? And the general nature of the PSRC model is that there's, I'm going to get a little bit technical here, there's not an income linkage between the type of job and the employment in the model specifically. How it makes that relationship between where somebody lives and works is based on the amount of travel time it takes to get there using various modes. But there's not, we can't specifically say this is a lower income job and this is a very high income community. There's no particular alignment between those two. So given what this project was doing, we were concerned that the model, the PSRC model, might concentrate too many of those trip origins and destinations too close together. So we wanted to know, well, if we look at Redmond, which has a similar situation in their industrial area surrounded by higher cost housing, similar with Woodinville, specifically because there's all the winery uses out there. Well, what does the pattern actually look like to make sure that we in fact pushed those trips a little bit further apart than the model would have tended to do? So those, while Redmond and Woodinville are different than Snoqualmie, the purpose was to try to find that analogous local example of that jobs and income relationship, to make sure that we weren't being overly sort of proximate, because the tendency is like, oh, well, there's jobs and housing being built right next to each other. Well, that doesn't mean that you can afford those together. So we wanted to use those other peer cities to understand that spatial distribution and make sure we distribute the trips basically far enough away that it's reasonable from an impact disclosure standpoint.
So was that decision to compare then to those other cities was to make help the PSRC model be more locally accurate than it otherwise would be? Okay. Yes. All right. Is there anything else that you heard from Mr. Norris or through Mr. Seidel's questions that you would like to respond to before? And I know we are getting late, so before we let you go.
Yeah, just perhaps one particular point that was brought up in Mr. Seidel's questioning of Mr. Schramm. There's a extensive discussion about transit and whether or not the analysis did an adequate job of disclosing transit impacts. And I think it is just worth noting that for an area like Snoqualmie, we don't typically do transit capacity impacts. We can't do a transit service impact because the city of Snoqualmie nor the applicant controls transit service. That's Metro's prerogative.
You're referring to King County Metro? Is yes, the transit agency?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah. So King County Metro is the entity that provides the service. So in an EIS, we're trying to disclose, well, with the trip generation of the proposed development, result in overcrowding of the service that we know is there or is expected to be there in the future. And looking at the amount of transit service and the loads, what we call the load factor on those services, I find it to be very much unlikely that we would see transit overloads resulting from the mill development, and therefore an explicit evaluation of that when we were reviewing, that did not rise to our level of concern. Whereas if we were in downtown Seattle or downtown Bellevue, yeah, we would typically want to be looking for that. It was just not something that warranted a transit trip generation estimate in this case. So I thought that was worth at least noting why we didn't flag it in our peer review, despite the questioning here today.
Okay, so it wasn't that you weren't interested in traffic. Was it more you didn't believe there would be an impact from the project on transit because there's so little service available? Is that fair?
Yeah, that is fair. In the sort of, I know it can be difficult to try to make transportation sections of EISs briefer, but we do look for opportunities to not overload it with analyses, and that was something we didn't see warranting further analysis than what was prepared.
Okay, thank you very much for your time this afternoon, Ms. Examiner. I don't have further questions on direct for Mr. Brayland.
All right. Thank you. Oh, good. I'm not unmuted, or I'm not muted. Good. Just to check in, I want to ask both Mr. Cartman and Mr. Seidels how long they think their cross might be for this witness.
Mine will be 0 minutes.
0 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Seidels, do you have an estimate?
20 seconds.
Oh, well, then we should definitely proceed with a 20-second cross.
Let's do. All right, Mr. Bryland, I just want to make sure I've got the kind of the ecology of all the different models figured out here. Sounds like you used the adjusted PSRC model to model the existing traffic conditions, correct?
We used the adjusted PSRC model to make sure that the future conditions were accurately represented by the EIS.
Future conditions meaning the existing kind of organic traffic within Snoqualmie plus some kind of growth rate?
Correct. In addition to verifying the specific mill site impacts, we had a separate scenario that had the mill site built out as defined in the EIS or the application.
And that's what PSRC was aimed at assessing in this EIS.
It was used, the principal use of this was to inform the trip distribution, understand where for 10W, where should they be distributing those trips, and as a verification that their trip generation rates using ITE were reasonable for the site as we know it.
Yeah, well, and that was just going to be my very next question. 10W were the ones who did the trip generation forecast, and they didn't use PSRC to do that. They used ITE, correct?
That is correct.
Why not just use PSRC all the way through?
So there's some disadvantages of using the PSRC all the way through. One moment, I have a dog down here that I need to redirect out of this room. Just a second.
Okay. Just for the record, Mr. Seidels, you have exceeded your 20 seconds. Good thing you're not under oath.
Yeah, right. These are follow-up questions. They're under the umbrella.
So yeah, the PSRC, why it wasn't used directly was that what we call the manual assignment that we have that 10W did allows us to track all the trips through all the intersections so that we can sort of follow what we call the trip distribution. The PSRC model, when we add those trips into the model, sometimes it can get you to some unusual results. I apologize. Let me make one more attempt at this.
Thank you.
I just want to take the moment to welcome Mr. Brayland to my world.
Okay, apologies again on the dog. Of course, he comes down.
So the
right
question
now.
was, why not just stick with PSRC all the way through?
So yeah, so the why not stick with the PSRC is that it can lead to some unusual, what we call assignments at the specific study intersections. So when the PSRC model adds traffic in, it can push other traffic out of the way. If somebody from the mill site is coming and going to somewhere in Snoqualmie Ridge 1, for example, at the business park, then some of those Snoqualmie Ridge 1 trips that were there before the mill site was added to the model get moved somewhere else. And it leads to what we call volume imbalances at the intersections, which can look a little bit unusual and often get sort of scrutinized when people look at the data. So when we do the manual assignment, it allows us to really track every single trip that's generated from the site to where its ultimate destination is, as opposed to dealing with a kind of a little bit of a reshuffling of the deck that we get with the PSRC model. At the end of the day, it's a bit more conservative because it pushes all those trips out of the study area, whereas more of those trips tend to get absorbed with the PSRC model. So we use it because it's clearer to just do the manual overlay, so long as the trip generation of what's being manually assigned is not substantially different than what the model would estimate. So that's why it's less of a black box, in other words.
How do you know where to manually assign the trips?
So the manual assignment is informed from the PSRC model itself. And you might ask, well, you should just use the model altogether. But what I'm poorly describing is that the trip distribution pattern from the model that we use, when you actually implement it in the model, it bumps other trips out of the way, and it can be hard to actually follow the individual trips, because sometimes trips from a site displace other trips, so it doesn't look like anything changed, even though those trips are actually from the model assigned to that location. It's just harder to explain.
I get it, but somebody has to make a call when you're doing manual assignment. Where are we going to send this car? Who makes that call?
Under the manual assignment, we provided the recommended distribution pattern to 10W. So they
based on what? Okay, great. Based on what?
Based on the PSRC model.
But the PSRC model doesn't necessarily do that assignment for you. So you have to manually do the assignment. How do you know where to do it? How do you know where to assign it to?
No, the PSRC model does do the explicit assignment of the trips, and we can track those trips from the site to see where they get distributed on the street. What we're avoiding is those trips that we can track in the PSRC model. We don't have all basically the confusion caused by the displaced trips that go away from the mill sites trips. So that's why it's not arbitrary. It's based on what the model's estimate of to where all those trips are going. We provide that so that the 10W can add those trips directly on top of, without any of the what we would call reassigned trips being lost.
All right, that's clear enough. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just check in. Mr. Sturbank, are we complete with this witness?
Just a quick question, if I may, on redirect, Mr. Braylon. So is the Snoqualmie adjusted part of the PSRC model, is that the same thing as saying it's a validation of the PSRC model? It's
a validation means different things to different people. What I would say is that it is a more refined version of the PSRC model that has more applicability within the city of Snoqualmie. Okay, and so when I thought I heard Mr. Norris say agree that it wouldn't be appropriate to use the PSRC model without validation. Do you agree with that statement? I do. Yes, I do agree with that. Okay, and was using the Snoqualmie adjusted PSRC model your way of using a more, I'll avoid validated, but I think you said finely adjusted or more accurate version of the PSRC model? Yes.
Okay,
Yes, it is. It's more accurate and it's more applicable to answer the questions that this EIS was asking.
okay, thank you. Yeah, and I don't have anything further, Ms. Examiner.
Okay. I'm just checking. Mr. Seidels is still video sharing. Did you have another follow-up? No. Okay. Okay, Mr. Berlin, thank you very much for your testimony and your time in this matter.
Thank you very much.
Let's see, it's 5:54. What's we're done for the day, right?
Right.
Ms. Clengen says yes, thank you.
I was going to introduce 6 more witnesses, but
No, you don't have 6 left, sir. All right, so let's just recap what we're going to do tomorrow real quick. I believe the witness testimony we have left is Mr. Schmidt on contamination. The city was talking about offering, I think it was characterized as brief testimony from Mr. Rogers. Is that still on the table?
Yeah, it is, Ms. Examiner, probably 20 minutes or so.
Great.
But that can, given the schedule and what's been discussed so far, I'd still anticipate Ms. Campbell very briefly first thing
Campbell.
on those emails. Then I think the applicant witnesses need to go and Mr. Rogers can wait for the end of that.
Okay. Applicant witnesses, is there additional besides Mr. Schmidt? Did I forget one?
At this point, we just anticipate the one witness. I mentioned I don't think we're going to have a second witness. If depending on what comes up in that for this first witness's testimony, it's possible, but unlikely.
Okay.
So I would say, and if so, it would be very, very short. So
And just remind me who the possible witness is.
Yes, Curtis Koger
Thank you.
would be our
Okay.
possible additional witness.
Thank you for reminding me. So that would be everybody's, the completion of everybody's direct case. I'd like to check in at that point. Do the appellants now have a better idea yet about potential rebuttal witnesses, or do we not know until the end of all that testimony?
I know that I would like to have Mr. Norris on for 45 minutes to an hour in rebuttal.
Okay.
And as to the others, we're evaluating. So I think we'll
Reserve.
on toxic, right? On toxics, we're not going to know until after that testimony tomorrow. As to the others, we're going to be using this evening to evaluate that.
Okay.
And we would let you know first thing in the morning.
All right. Are we all prepared to make heroic efforts tomorrow to complete tomorrow so that we do not have to identify a 6th day for this hearing? If we need to do that, the earlier we look, the better. And I'm just throwing it out there. Can we be heroic and stay as late as possible tomorrow?
I think we'll be pretty brief with ours. Mr. Seidels has more, I think, than the other ones would be. I don't think that's going to be typical for our.
Okay. So that's all. Oh, Mr. Sturbank wanted to say something.
I was just going to inquire, would the appellant's rebuttal witnesses would be the same witnesses who have already been listed?
Yeah, there's no one new.
Okay.
And is there an estimate for the time for Mr. Schmidt?
Well, that is a good question. I would say an hour and a half on direct. It depends on, of course, objections and then cross. So since contamination is a significant issue, I would anticipate his testimony will take, I will say, not as long as Mr. Schramm's, but it will still be substantial. It won't be a 15-minute one. So I would anticipate most of the morning probably, but hopefully not.
And
Hopefully not sliding into the afternoon.
I need to check with Mr. Seidels, but when we shift to and also with Ms. Clengen, but when we shift to rebuttal, I have a Superior Court argument at 1:30 tomorrow. So I'm out 1:30 to 2:30. I believe it's just an hour. But between Mr. Seidels and Ms. Clengen's witnesses, I think you can anticipate they would be the first ones in the afternoon, and then I would be later in the afternoon.
We can accommodate that. I think as long as you're not needed to hear the other witnesses' testimony, then that
Yeah, that'll be fine.
I'm pretty confident we'll go. Did you say 1:30 to 2:30?
Right.
Right. And worst case scenario, we will break if we need to and have you come back. Because we can use things like breaks to block out time tomorrow and finish
Yeah.
tomorrow.
But, between transportation, wetlands and toxics, I'm sure while our rebuttal won't be terribly long, it'll fill up an hour, those three at least. So I
Okay.
think we'll be fine.
And if an appellants do know, and you do know who you're going to call on rebuttal, may not be till tomorrow morning, but if it's earlier, we'd appreciate a heads up just so that we can tell our witnesses either show up tomorrow or don't show up tomorrow, depending on the subject matter.
Yeah, if we exclude any, we'll let you know. I think it's likely all of them will testify, if only briefly. I mean, I would be surprised if we had nothing from one or more of them. But I don't think it'll be a lot from any of them, other than Mr. Seidel's indicated a fair amount for transportation.
Thank you.
Right. Any other business this evening? Of course, at the end of the direct case is when we will be moving into discussing the exhibits. I'm going to clean up my master list here with this afternoon's inclusions, and I will circulate that right after we disconnect. Hopefully Mr. Monroe or Mr. Rogers would be able to forward that to everybody this evening so that we have that to look at. Anything else?
A start time for tomorrow. Did we already discuss that?
We did not. Ms. Campbell's first. Mr. Sherbank, what time?
I thought I had heard 8 o'clock earlier today when we chatted about it. I think she would be ready to go then.
Okay, I think 8 o'clock is consistent with heroic measures. I feel quite heroic, and we'll do it a third day in a row.
I'd rather 8 o'clock tomorrow
Yes.
than 6
Then
o'clock
8 p.m.
tomorrow.
Then
Right.
8 p.m. tomorrow. Right.
Exactly. I think
Yes.
everyone.
Okay. All right. I want to thank everybody. It's been a long and very technically intense day. I'm glad we have a transcript to confirm my typing. I do think by typing, by the way. That's why I take notes by typing during the hearing. I appreciate everybody's time. Thanks very much. We will convene again tomorrow morning at 8.
Thank you.